Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm not a lawyer or a political scientist, but rather a historian. And those who specialize in my craft spend most of our time not looking at the present or ahead. We look at what has happened and why that happened, not at what is going on right now and where will what is happening right now lead. So my talk will be a little bit different than others who might be speaking about the same event, the military takeover that happened in Myanmar, your neighbor across the border. Now, before I really begin talking, I want to stress three things. First, I attach no moral values to what I'm saying here. I'm not going to discuss the military takeover as morally bad or the protests as morally good. This is something anybody can do from their own perspective and values, and some will have different judgments on both sides. Historians are really just technicians of data. That's all historians really are. We assemble data and analyze it to make sense of it, not to achieve any goals beyond getting as close as they can to the truth. Second, I am pursuing here my truth as a historian. The truth is what I believe the data says to me, whether or not that belief fits neatly along the lines or within the scope of the data we have available to us at any given time. As historians, we have come a long way. My field has come a long way since the 19th century, and we understand a lot more about the politics of knowledge and how not power determines, as Michel Foucault would say, what can be seen. We know that what a document tells us is what we are meant to hear for a reason, not because it describes what has actually happened. More than having the problems of being fed data for a particular motive, we also seek truth rather than fact, because there is always a paucity of data, always, whether 100 years ago or 5 minutes ago. As any intelligence officer will tell you, decision makers often only have 60 or 70% of the data they need to make a decision, and the rest is guesswork. You fill in the rest with experience, with intuition, even with comparative modeling. Historians do the same, although most do not realize it or admit it, nor do the readers realize this. This is why historiography is the truth as one or another historian sees it, but it is not strictly fact. Each historian has their own tools unique to them, shaped by their own experiences and ways of seeing the world. Historians believe they interpret the data in a way they think is objective, but in fact is always 100% of the time at some level subjective. Every history is not a guide to what actually happened, but instead it's a guide to how a particular historian, thinks about something that happened. Its authority to the event is secondary. Its primary authority is to the way that historian thinks about the world. Third, I'm going to raise here not the specter of the burden of history, but the burden of experience that bears on all of us and all the people you see right now in the news in Myanmar, everyone from Aung San Suu Kyi to Min Aung Hlaing to the protesters on the street. It is our experience, our personal experience, that helps to shape our data into something that makes sense. It informs us, it guides us, it structures the world before us, where we think it's been, where it is, and where it is going. It is a faulty tool just as much. It misinforms us, it misguides us, and it misstructures the world we see in front of us. And this is a reason we make mistakes as analysts. It is the reason that generals fight battles with the lessons of the last war. It is the reason historians make bad calls about contemporary events. The world, since they had that experience, has in the meantime changed. The structures may appear the same, the institutions may look the same, but this is fundamentally an illusion. So in short, I will be discussing the military takeover and what has happened, not in terms of what I think is morally right or wrong. I'm looking for truth that may appear to disagree with apparent facts that I would argue have been largely misunderstood. Now, this is a big claim, but I hope you can suspend judgment until I've made the case that I'm going to present here. I'm not going to call what happened on Monday morning, the 2nd of February, 2021, a coup. I'm going to call it, as I have up to now, a military takeover. The military moved on Monday morning, arresting President Win Myint and State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi, as well as others associated with the National League for Democracy. I'll be referring to as NLD from here on. Now, I said at the time that this was not a coup, and I still stand by this. Any move in which someone asserts power over government or part of the government by force is indeed a coup, or you might call it a push. You can have a coup de force, as the Japanese had in Indochina in March 1945 against the French administration. You can have an unconstitutional coup d'etat where the civilian constitutional government is toppled by the military, as in the case of Allende's Chile on the 11th of September 1973. You can even have a party coup where a leader of a country is merely removed from power by fellow politicians, as in the case of Megawati Sukarnoputri. And many are running around right now looking for words to use to describe the military takeover in Myanmar as a soft coup as opposed to a hard coup. A coup can mean everything from the brutal, heavy hand of armed force to the lighter touch of unarmed constitutional correction. However, it is almost always deployed to conjure up the image of the extreme. Its technical meaning is for any kind of unwilling change in government, but its usage and intended purpose is almost always to describe an illegal, unconstitutional, and violent military move against a civilian government. Political scientists, and they'll fight over shades of meaning, will disagree. That's their field. But for popular audiences, everyday people, when someone says coup, this is the mental image that emerges. The intent of its deployment is always to force the audience to then frame their interpretations of the events occurring through their exposure, through films and history and real events of hard military takeovers. Then, as the limited amounts of data come in from the events, the gaps are filled by everything they know about the archetypical hard military coup. And we start to filter the data coming in through this overall framing. So the event becomes an illegal, unconstitutional, and violent military move against a civilian government. And the analysis and the solutions that rise to counter it are those learned from the last illegal, unconstitutional, and violent military move against a civilian government. But what if it is not an illegal, not unconstitutional, and not a violent military move against a non-civilian government? By mobilizing the framework of an illegal, unconstitutional, and violent military move against a civilian government, it is impossible to see the military takeover any other way. And it is less and less possible to see any solution or analysis appropriate to the situation that is occurring. More to the point, if those behind the military takeover genuinely view this as legal, constitutional, and nonviolent, by contrast to those who view it as illegal, unconstitutional, and violent, how does the historian or any other person decide this? And during what moment do we decide this? When do we go beyond what we see, the 60% of data at hand, and mobilize our experience, our intuition, and so on? Again, all of these being imperfect and peculiar tools to help us along with the missing 40% so that we can arrive at a conclusion of what has happened. I will call that moment, for convenience, the moment of personal interpretation. It is the moment that those who favor or are opposed to the military takeover will try to deprive you of. Both sides, both those who favor and both those who are against the military takeover, will both try to deprive you of your own moment of personal interpretation. The moment of personal interpretation used to be a very significant time in most of human history. Time moved more slowly because most of the data you needed to think about, to consider to make a decision with, was right in front of you. For much of our human history, we have lived in societies with smaller populations, with more immediate and intimate leaders. News arrived much more slowly and in small batches, the more distance there was from the events from your physical location. Whatever was happening, we usually in the old days had lots and lots of time to think without constantly being told what to think by too many people at any one time. The moment of personal interpretation could be extremely long and significant to interpret any particular important development. Now we're in the middle of the third industrial revolution, what some people call the digital revolution. And this is the third industrial revolution has changed all of this. It has robbed your generation of your moment of personal reflection, or it has diced it up and restricted it as much as possible. The power of information creation and sharing has magnified the volume and speed of data our society receives everywhere. The flow is lightning fast. It's huge and overwhelming. It never stops. It plugs you in and plants ready-made images in your head. And from social media, you absorb the borrowed experiences from many, many other people. And this has changed your relationship to the interpretation of data. Too little data in the past, coupled with too much time, meant personal interpretation was necessarily an important survival skill. Today, too much data too fast is an assault. More and more people find it difficult to make judgments about more than a small selection of the data they receive, and they have to be very quick about it. This means that the moment of personal interpretation is already very brief, much shorter than it would have been 100 years ago or even 30 years ago. And state actors and media giants and corporations and the like all know this, and they try to instrumentalize this overwhelming inflow of data by giving you a ready-made key to making sense of it. So there was a coup, there was a coup or peaceful takeover, there was a peaceful legal takeover, but you do not decide, you do not reflect independently. You have been told, and you do not escape from the framing. Coke is great, Coca-Cola is great, Salvador Ferragamo looks nice. This is a hard military coup. This is a soft military coup. You are fed these ready-made images. Now, in the last week, almost all the analysis I have seen has asked, why did the military make its move? Why does it not like the prospect of civilian rule? What will happen next? I do not think I or anyone I have listened to has been asked even once, what did the Burmese military think about the legitimacy of its own move? Or did the military think what it was doing was legal? Well, of course not. For the media, their experience with Myanmar was the past. They have filled in the gap in their knowledge with what they know about the military's actions in the past, the well-known hard coup of 1962, and what was effectively an incremental hard coup in 1990. Let's suspend these notions, though, for a moment and consider several elements of what led to the military takeover. There have been two ways to approach constitutional interpretation in the U.S. and other places as well. There's two main approaches. Those who go by the specifics of what a constitution says, and those who go by what they believe the framers of the Constitution meant, the spirit of the Constitution. I think everyone would agree that for Myanmar, the spirit of the 2008 Constitution, promulgated in 2010, was for the military to permanently limit the extent to which elected civilian members of government could exercise power. There were numerous articles included that set up controls that remained in military hands, including provisions to give the military commander control over the government in cases of national emergency. From their viewpoint, allowing a limited democratic space that also protected their institutional and personal interests, was allowable, and they produced a constitution they believed would do this, would allow a limited democratic space, but allow them to maintain their grip on all that was important. The elections that occurred on the 8th of November 2020 saw the NLD sweep the polls. The military-backed party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, only won 33 seats. By contrast, the NLD won 396 out of 476 seats, under which they could form a government for 5 years. These were valid elections, but as some have commented, they were not entirely fair, as some areas of the country were not allowed to vote. Evidence suggests that there were irregularities in voting, although it appears it wasn't the NLD that did this, it was the military that did this. The military-backed party, the USDP party, as I mentioned, lost. The NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi now had a huge mandate they would use to roll back the constitutional limitations once the new government was in session, including a provision that barred Aung San Suu Kyi from holding the presidency herself. The Army and the USDP claimed election fraud involving 8.6 million irregularities they claimed they saw in voter lists in 314 townships. The data that we have tells us that General Min Aung Hlaing genuinely believed that the claims of fraud were legitimate. In January, he even tried to convince a clueless People's Republic of China Foreign Minister Wang Yi of this, revealing to him sheets and sheets of electoral roll data. The military awaited a decision by the Union Election Commission that would validate the claims of fraud they believed and require a new election. The Union Election Commission announced, however, on the 28th of January 2021 that it had rejected the claims of fraud and would not investigate. Two factors weigh heavily on what happened next. First, this announcement was made only a few days before the new session of government. Hence, it required a very quick action if anything was going to be done. And second, the military, I think by most accounts, the military was genuinely surprised at the UEC, at the Union Electoral Commission decision. Certainly, Min Aung Hlaing appears to have genuinely seen this as an emergency in view of NLD plans for constitutional change to the provisions that assured the military control. He said he could not rule out a military action to resolve this crisis, but he did assure everyone soon after that the military would act according to the Constitution. Many seem to have assumed, and I think wrongly, that the military taking over and acting according to the Constitution, as Min Aung Hlaing saw it, were different things, and interpreted wrongly this as Min Aung Hlaing backing down from a threat. This does not seem to have been the case. He seems to have merely clarified that the military takeover, if it did occur, would occur within the terms of the Constitution. He also promised that if the Constitution were not followed by the NLD, the military might withdraw the Constitution. As Min Aung Hlaing proclaimed, we all need to abide by the Constitution. If one does not follow the law, such law must be revoked. If it is the Constitution, it is necessary to revoke the Constitution. And I'll return to this point again, but I'll briefly mention here that the military was fixated on the spirit of the Constitution, the spirit with which they believed the Constitution was supposed to operate in their favor. In other words, how was it intended to work by and for the military? If it was not working as it should, the general made clear he would end the Constitution. Min Aung Hlaing chose not to abrogate the Constitution. The military entered into 2 days of negotiations with the NLD that were brokered by the People's Republic of China to avoid conflict, during which it has been reported Aung San Suu Kyi refused to concede on any point. The military then prepared to move, many of us hearing that this action was imminent many hours before it happened. So we knew from Saturday night that the military was going to move. Myanmar awoke on Monday morning to the news of the military takeover, a state of emergency for a year, and then new elections that would take place afterwards. This was immediately labeled by the NLD and foreign sympathizers as an archetypical military coup. The rest everyone has seen in the news. The West has complained. The UN Security Council has expressed deep concerns. The US has most recently decided to impose targeted sanctions against the generals. Hundreds, then thousands of Burmese have launched, tens of thousands of Burmese have launched a civil disobedience campaign. The military has continued to stress that it is operating according to the Constitution. There have been many academic discussions about this. Most analysts agree with the view that this is a coup and that technically the Constitution was broken. I would also agree with the view that the Constitution was not followed technically, according to a literal reading of the articles. Technically, the president, in consultation with the military, is the one who declares a national emergency. And in the present case, in the present military takeover, the president refused to declare a national emergency, and then the military decided to replace him by rumor at the point of a gun with the vice president, one of the vice presidents, who then declared a national emergency. Now, 2 points are important here. First, the Constitution is badly written. There are significant gray areas, and arguably there are internal contradictions. On these grounds alone, though, the takeover would be on a weak footing. The military seems to have realized this soon after, and so conducted house searches and uncovered evidence that Aung San Suu Kyi had 10 walkie-talkies, and so had committed that had been not registered, and so had committed a minor offense under Article 8 of the Export and Import Law. While Win Myint had broken the National Disaster Management Law in November for not wearing a mask at a NLD public rally despite COVID regulations. Second, and I would argue this is the main reason to consider, the takeover was consistent with how the military viewed the spirit of the framing of the Constitution. And again, I don't mean morally right or morally wrong. I'm just looking at how they view it. From Min Aung Hlaing's perspective, built on a foundation of belief that the military is the only force that can hold the country together, constitutional change on the basis of elections where he believed there was fraud without the UEC conducting an investigation and agreeing to a delay to the change in government amounted to a truly national emergency. This was what the military had pushed for the Constitution to guarantee for them. The Constitution was designed to prevent a full transfer of power to civilian politicians. When the president, Win Myint, failed to agree to declare this to be a national emergency, the military moved and then followed steps laid out in the Constitution for the commander of the military to assume, for a period of time, the sovereignty of the country. I also understand why their understanding of the past and the way the event was framed led many to view it as an archetypical coup, but I would like to stress that this is not how the military views it. And the military does not understand, for similar reasons, why Burmese see it as an archetypical coup and not as a legitimate action taken according to the Constitution. And the longer each side frames the same event, though, through their own peculiar instrumentalized framework, the harder and more distant and self-involuted their views of this will become. Now, there are lots of reasons, excuse me, I need to drink a water. There are lots of reasons to dislike the military in Myanmar. Some of the generals have built fortunes on exploitation of the resources of the country. They have their power by moving up the ranks, not by selection or election by the civilian population. Myanmar people on the whole do not have many of the freedoms many people enjoy elsewhere. But when those who have power look at the world and their place in it, they frame it in different imaginaries. Although the Western construction of knowledge pretends there's just one world, the world we see, the real one, and anything else is a fantasy or rationalization, in reality, everyone sees the world in two ways simultaneously, in ways that shape their interactions with other people on a daily basis. First, there is the mundane way that actors see their daily life as people, their biological functions, their physical needs, their individual survival, which we can call their mundane reality. And then, second, there is the larger social fiction that shapes the way we all see the world around us. We couldn't function otherwise. For example, when you and I look at a street in Bangkok, we see restaurants with food, stores with clothes, hundreds of people, including men, women, children, young people, old people, and so on. We think about our salaries, what time to take our prescription medicines, whether we owe taxes, who we date, who we marry, when we will retire. This is the world of ourselves. It is our realm of personal, intimate human interactions, and this is our mundane reality. Second, there is also what Charles Taylor calls our social imaginary. This is the socially organized institutional view we have of the world, how we fit in with others. As Taylor describes what he means, it's the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellow human beings, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. This is just as much part of our personal reality. We simultaneously, all of us, walk the mundane reality and the social imaginary all the time. Their overlap requires constant negotiation between them to survive in daily life, so that the same person is at the same time a human and a doctor, a human and a student, a human and a citizen, a human and a general. But normally they have to decide which identity, their personal self or their social self, will structure how they make a decision at any given moment. The highly peculiar, individuated, and unique interaction that results from these choices eventually synchronizes into a perception of the world operating according to its own logic. The mind has unconsciously shaped, through a million small negotiations, how each person views the world, and this result is what I refer to as a mindscape, a person's mindscape. If we put the same people through the same experiences with the same roles, social roles, you have a group of mindscapes that may be very similar, indeed, but at some level, everybody's mindscape is unique at some level. The key here, though, is that the mind has produced a view of the world that combines personal needs with social roles that seems right to the individual. It makes sense, it is unconscious. In this way, the Myanmar generals can fill their pockets with the nation's resources and still see themselves as the true defenders of the nation. And this is the problem for moving on here. In their mindscape, in the general's mindscape, the military takeover of the 2nd of February was not a coup. Yes, they have built up personal fortunes, but they see themselves as the only protectors of the country. In opposing the coup, critics both at home and abroad, in Myanmar and abroad, have created charges that the military generals do not countenance, cannot countenance, and will not countenance. That what they have done is wrong, that it is against the Constitution as they had planned it out, the spirit of the Constitution. And so we are in an impasse as long as this is not realized. A legitimate question somebody might ask, or criticism of what I've said, would then be, regarding the attack on the Rohingyas in August 2017, did the military generals not view themselves as doing the same thing? That is, protecting the country's security. I believe that they did view themselves as doing that. In their perspective, they could move to take over Rohingya lands for personal profit, and they could kill, and they could do all the other things that occurred, and at the same time still believe that their actions were fulfilling their roles as protectors of the Burmese nation. The intention and effect, I believe, was indeed genocide. Some people will say it was ethnic cleansing, but I believe it was one thing, and other people believe another, but let's leave that aside. But regardless of whether it's genocide or ethnic cleansing, they saw this as an acceptable cost or the most effective measure. This does not excuse what occurred, and it doesn't alleviate the criminality involved. The Nazis saw the final solution in the same way, as an acceptable cost and effective measure that they had to undertake, but which also did not alleviate their criminality involved in their case, in the Holocaust. Now, the other side of the coin is that there's been no real effort to understand Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD's behavior once they had been framed as civilian victims of a military coup. The response internationally has been relatively anemic. There have been expressions of concern and deep concern and some targeted sanctions. This was due to Aung San Suu Kyi's lack of comment on atrocities against the Rohingya in 2017 and her defense of the military in the International Court of Justice in 2019. At home, however, the Burmese civil disobedience campaign has filled the streets with protesters for many days. The NLD ensured that the takeover was viewed as an archetypical coup and that themselves and portrayed themselves, the NLD, as the archetypical civilian victims. Not accepting this view is not to assert that the takeover was morally correct, as some have misunderstood my argument to mean. Instead, I am merely trying to sort out what has actually happened without allowing the NLD to instrumentally and politically frame my thinking that would prevent me from seeing the takeover any other way than they would wish me to do. Aung San Suu Kyi has on numerous occasions revealed important insights into her own mindscape, how she would like her mindscape viewed, or a mixture of revelatory slippage and strategic fictions. She's a politician. The most consistent insight in recent years has been her desire for a close relationship with the military that her father created. She has apparently revealed that she does not view the events that took place in Rakhine from 2017 as a genocide. A crucial insight is that Aung San Suu Kyi has consistently shown particular upset with constitutional limitations on her ability to hold the office of president. One of the points on which she is rumored to have refused to concede during the military takeover preceding the military takeover was her intention to change this provision in the Constitution. This was a major NLD goal last year, if we go back to February and March. Former supporters, such as the U.S. politician Bill Richardson, after visiting her, found the revelation of her actual views, once she was in power, objectionable and publicly withdrew support. A fair summary would be that she entertains a view of ethnics, and particularly Muslims, in the same way that the generals do, in a negative way. By many accounts, she has ruled the NLD party with a tough autocratic hand. Her control of the NLD and reliance on a coterie of older cronies, the so-called uncles, has meant that space has not been opened for a new, younger generation of leaders within the party. Many have instead been forced out and have founded new, or they've joined existing, competing parties, such as the Democratic Party for a New Society. This might be interpreted as the necessary realpolitik, the human landscape, the difficulties that she has to endure, Aung San Suu Kyi, to control a party in Myanmar's contemporary context. And it might be inconsistent with her mindscape of her role and actions. But what has actually meant is that international What it has meant is international misunderstanding of the reaction to the military takeover. On the one hand, the Burmese civil disobedience campaign has been about democracy and a return of the limited democratic space that the military has not brought under control, and it is not essentially about Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD. On the other hand, the default position of news media and many observers is that the Burmese civil disobedience campaign has been completely about support for Aung San Suu Kyi personally and for the NLD itself, not for their restoration per se as a restoration of the results of the election for the purpose of preserving democracy. The misunderstanding may have significant consequences as details of the circumstances around the military takeover become clearer. If it is the case that Aung San Suu Kyi's reluctance to concede on any point to the military was to ensure that she could hold the presidency rather than the NLD concocted position of state counselor, then she could be argued to have risked the people's democratic space for the achievement of her personal ambitions. It would also raise the possibility that her defense of the military's actions at the ICJ in 2019 may have also been a calculated move to gain the military's support for her later prospective move to change the constitution towards this end as well. It may also mean that Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD become sidelined permanently if and when the democratic space is opened once again and other parties step into the vacuum. The biggest lesson to draw, though, is that the solution to what Burmese want is not necessarily the same as what would give Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD what they want. These are not necessarily the same goals. It might be that Aung San Suu Kyi stepping aside and allowing other younger democratic leaders to come to the fore may be a quicker path to growing the democratic space than any other move. Now, I'm going to conclude, but I want to conclude by stressing again that I'm not making moral judgments here. I am not favoring the military or Aung San Suu Kyi. I am certainly not condoning the coup, what people are calling the coup, the military takeover. Instead, what I'm trying to do is to encourage us to depoliticize our frameworks for viewing the different actors involved. I think currently what can be called the intense heat of the moment, many are not yet trying to do this. Many analysts are holding back until there's more data available to make a clearer call. Fair enough. Many also, however, have succumbed to the initial framing of this event and have not been able to escape the way that it structures the data coming in. This is also not about being fair, but effectively sizing up the situation accurately. We need to understand how both sides view the situation and how each thinks independently instead of having someone else shape this information for us. The reason is that unless we can accurately assess each side's perspectives, which are often detached consciously from underlying motives, the different sides will be locked together with no way to detach, and it will get more and more difficult as we move on. We will thus never arrive at a solution. A major obstacle here, and one that will be an ever increasingly a global problem, is our decreasing ability, because of the digital revolution, or the opportunity for this ability, to have significant moments of personal reflection. This is being eroded as you continue to be constantly pounded with data and efforts to frame your thinking through your cell phone and through your laptop. I would like to end with an alteration of a famous quote. I would say, rather than those who do not understand history are doomed to repeat it, that instead, those who do not understand why they view history the way they do are doomed not to have the truth. So thank you for your attention and your time, and I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. They may entirely have been on my side, so apologies for that. Thank you very much.